Today I thought I'd show you how you can download a file through HISE. So we're going to make a basic downloader. It's going to have a start button, a pause button, and an abort button. We're only going to download one file, and this is to demonstrate the server API, the file system API, and the file API. Those are the main APIs we're going to be using today. In a follow-up video, we'll look at downloading multiple files at the same time, but to keep things simple, we'll just focus on a single file for today. So the first thing is to build out our UI, and we're just going to have the three buttons on here. So this will be the start button, and then we'll have the pause resume button, and then the abort button. The start and the abort button will make those momentary, and for all of them we'll turn off save in preset. And now we'll get references for each of these controls. And we're going to assign a callback for each control as well. So that's the callback for the start button. When the start button's clicked, it's going to trigger this function here. So we'll just duplicate this for the other two. So this will be the pause resume button. And to do this multiple cursor thing, I'm just selecting the first one, then I'm pressing Ctrl and D, and it's selecting the next instances of that selected text. And then I can just type the name of the next control, so it makes it really quick. I'm just going to rearrange these buttons so that we can see them a bit more clearly. Okay, the next thing we need is something to download, a file to download. So we're going to download the HISE logo. So I'm going to make a variable called URL, and this is going to be the URL of the file we want to download. So in this case, it's going to be the HISE logo from the HISE website. So that's this link here, but this can be any file you want. We're also going to need somewhere to download the file to, so I'm going to use my downloads folder. And we're going to access that through the file system API. If you're not familiar with the file system API, I have other videos covering that, so I'm not going to go into detail here. But we're just going to get the downloads folder. And we're going to store it in this variable. So that's how we get the downloads folder. We use the constant filesystem.downloads. We're also going to need two variables to track if the pause button or the abort button has been pressed. We'll declare these as reg variables. And we'll look at how we'll use these a bit later on. So in our start button's callback, we'll first of all check if the button has been pressed. So we just do if value, so that means the button's been pressed and not released, because this is a momentary button. It triggers the callback on both mouse down and mouse up. So we do this if value to make sure it's triggering whatever we want it to do on mouse down only. And what we want it to do is trigger a function called start download. We haven't made this function yet, but that's the function we're going to make. I like to avoid putting the functionality within the callback and instead put the functionality into a function that is called by the callback. It just seems a bit neater to me, and in doing it this way, it means you can reuse this start download function, for example, in multiple parts of your code or in other projects. So for the pause button, this is pause and resume, and this isn't a momentary button, this is an on-off toggle button. We're going to do two things. If the button is pressed and turned on, we're going to pause the downloads, and if it's pressed and turned off, we're going to resume the downloads. So we'll have an if statement in here. We'll say if value, so if the button's on, we're going to call a function called pause downloads. And if it's off, we're going to call a function called resume downloads. We're also going to change the button's text depending on if it's on or off, so it says resume or pause as appropriate. So we'll use the ternary operator here. So if the value is 0, so the button's off, we're going to set the text of the component, and the component in this case is passed in to the callback function here as component. So this is the button. We're going to set the text to pause, and then the ternary operator, which is just the same as writing an else, will set the text to resume. And we should also set this text up here as well by default, so when you first press on init, it will reset this button to being a pause button. So we'll do btn pause.setValue 0 btn pause.set text pause. And if we click this button, let's zoom in on that. If we click the button, it's going to change the text to say resume. Oh, it's trying to call the functions, of course. So let's just comment that out for a moment because we haven't written those functions yet. So we click the button, it says resume, click it again, it says pause. If we leave it on resume and recompile, it's going to reset and go back to saying pause. Yeah, so that all works. So I'll uncomment this again, and we will implement those functions shortly. Let's get rid of this so we've got a bit more room. There we go, that's nicer. And then for the abort button, it's pretty much the same thing as we had for the start button. We're going to check the value because this is a momentary button. So if value abort downloads. So now all we need to do is write these functions. So it makes sense to start by writing the function for the start button to actually start the download. So we'll write that down here. Call this section functions. Let's just add a few lines there so we're not writing right at the bottom of the window. So we'll call this inline function start download. And the first thing we're going to do before we start the download is make sure our pause and abort variables, the ones we have up here, are reset. And then what we need to do is we're going to start with the server API. We're going to call a function called setBaseURL. And what this function does is, first of all, it tells HISE that you're going to be doing stuff with a server, so it starts all the server stuff running in the background for handling server-side calls. The other thing it does is it sets a URL segment so that when we write further URLs, we don't need to write that bit of the URL. So let me demonstrate, for example. Let's say our website was google.com. So we would go server.set base URL http google.com. So that's our website. And now if in the next part of our program we wanted to call, let's say, google.com/translate with like a post request, we could do something like server call with post, and it's asking for a sub URL. Now, so instead of having to write out our full URL again, we would just put the bit that we want to go after it. So that would be translate. And because we've set this base URL, it would actually be calling google.com/translate. So the base URL is just a thing we put in there to make our lives easier, because most of the time, all your calls are going to be going to the same place. Now, in our case, our call is going to be going to https ://forum.hise.audio, and then all this other stuff. So we could set our base URL to be this forum.hise.audio, but what I like to do with downloads is just set it to this beginning bit, https or http, depending on your URL. So that is what I would set the base URL to, is just https. And then when we actually call our URL, this part here, when we actually call it in the download, we're going to replace this part of the URL with just nothing. So it will add on the rest of the URL. I find this works quite reliably if you're getting these download links from a server call in the first place, which is why I'm doing it this way. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need somewhere to store our file once we've downloaded it. So we're going to use the file system API here again. We're going to create a file, we'll call it F. And this is going to be in our downloads folder, and you remember we've already got a reference to our downloads folder here. So downloads folder .get child file, and we'll just call this file test.png. You can call this whatever you want, and in more advanced scenarios you'd be getting these file names from the file that you're actually downloading. But we'll just keep it simple, we'll call it test.png. And then the next thing to do is just download the file, and this is really easy. We write server.download file, and we fill in these parameters. So it's asking for the URL. So our URL is in this variable called URL, so we write URL. And we want to replace that HTTPS part because that's going to be put in there already by this base URL call. So I write URL.replace HTTPS like that. The other way to do it is to just remove it from this up here. We just delete it there. Because I usually get my URLs from an initial server call that brings down all the download links, I'm in the habit of having to replace this in scripting anyway, so that's why I just put it in like this, and you'll probably find it easier. Unless you're hard coding the URLs, you'll probably find it easier to handle it this way as well. For parameters, this is an object that so far as I've seen, it doesn't actually seem to do anything, but maybe it does. But you'll use this if you're making other server calls like get and post requests, but for downloads, I just leave that as an empty object. The target file is the file that we're actually going to download to, so that's our F file here, our test.png file, so we just put F in there. And the callback is a function we can call that's going to get feedback about the download. So as the file's downloading, this callback function is going to be triggered every few seconds or maybe every few milliseconds, and it's going to give us the progress of the download and some other bits of information. So this will be a function. We could write it in here directly as a function, but I prefer to make the download callback a separate function. So we'll just write download callback, and we'll declare that as a function separately. And we'll do that here, and it has to be, because it's a callback, it just has to be a normal function, so it's not an inline function, it's just a function. And we'll write download callback. So the information we get in the download callback is in an object called this, and that object has another object called data. So we check this.data.finished to see if the download is finished, this.data.success to see if the download has finished and was successful, num total, how big is the download file, and num downloaded, how much have we downloaded so far. So in our download callback, we're going to keep this really simple. We're going to have an if statement that says if this.data.finished console.print this.data.success done. So if it was successful, it's done. Else, we're using the ternary operator here again, fail. And this example is actually taken directly from the docs. Just here, we've got this example, console.print data success. If you do try and copy and paste this example, you'll get an error, and that's because of the typo here. Success is only spelt with one C here. So if you do use this example and you're getting an error, just add an extra C in the word success, then it should work. Or it may have been fixed by the time you're watching this video. Okay, so this is going to tell us if our download succeeded or failed, and now we're in a position to test it. So let's open this back up. Now, one thing you want to have when you're working with the server API is you want to be able to see the data that you're downloading and the calls that you're making to the server and the information you're getting back. And we have a window in here called the server controller. And if you go up to this icon here, Show Custom Pop-up, click on there and click Create New Pop-up. And we'll click that button then, it allows us to move it around. Right click in here and uncheck Toggle Global Layout. Right click again and select Server Controller, and now you have a Server Controller window. And if we select our interface script there, so this will give you information about your server calls. And so you don't have to do all this again. Once you've done it, click this save icon and give it a name like Server Controller. And now you can close this window, and when you go up to your little Show Custom Pop-up button again, it's there in the list, Server Controller, and you can click that and you've got your window again. You probably also want to do the same with things like the module browser, which I've done here already. But it's just a handy little feature there. Another way you can do this is you can add it as a floating tile. You go to View, Add Floating Window. Right click, and again, same thing, Server Controller. Or the way I prefer to do it is have a custom workspace set up, and in here I've got the Server Controller window in a tab here. So I can see my UI and the server controller at the same time. However you choose to get it on the screen, just make sure you've got the server controller visible because you're going to be using that a lot. So now I'm going to click Start, and hopefully I've done everything correctly, and it's going to download an image to my Downloads folder. So my Downloads folder is currently empty. Let's keep that on the top, let's hit Start. And it's downloading, and there we go, it's downloaded the HISE logo, and it's called test.png. And you can see it gave us some information here while it was downloading, the file size, the speed, and it had the options to abort and pause. Now, because this is such a tiny file, 0.08 megabytes, we wouldn't have time to click Start and then abort or pause before it's downloaded. So I'm going to change the URL we're using to a different file that's on a server, and it's a large file, so it'll take a while to download. So this is a much larger file, it's a zip file, so all I'm going to do is replace my URL, and this is HTTP rather than HTTPS, so I just need to adjust these values here in my base URL. What I often do in my actual project is I set this prefix in a variable up at the top, and then I can just change that variable, but for the sake of this demonstration it's fine just to hard code it here like that. So this file's a bit larger, it's about 100 megabytes, so that should give time for the download to be going. Because it's a zip file, I'll change test.png to test.zip. And we'll just do a little test to make sure that works. So if I click download, we can see it's now downloading a 100 meg file, and it's taking much longer. And we can see it's appeared over here, but obviously it's not finished downloading yet. And there we go, now the download's complete. So we'll delete both of these. Now when we hit compile, you notice it still says complete there. We can actually get rid of those by clicking this bin icon, or we can call a function to clear those. And we'll call a function. So every time we hit compile, we're going to clear out the old downloads. So we'll just put it here at the top, and it's server clean finished downloads. So now when I hit F5, it's going to clear out these finished downloads. There we go. So the next thing we want to do is implement our pause and resume functions. So we'll add these down here. Okay, so let's start with pausing a download. So when we pause a download, we want to set our pause variable, the one that we've got up here, to true. We'll say pause equals true. And then in our download callback, we can check if pause is true, and if it is, we can pause the download. So the download callback gives us the this object, and this actually refers to a download object. There is a class within HISE called download, and let me show you that. And you can see we've got all this functionality for the download object. So this is of type download, so it has all these functions available. And you can see there's one there, resume, stop, and abort. So stop is the one we use for pausing the download. So in our download callback, we can check if the pause button has been pressed because our pause variable will be true, and if it is, we can stop the download. So we say if pause this dot stop. So let's test that. I'll hit compile. We'll hit start, and then after it's going for a little while, I'll hit pause. So we're downloading, I hit the pause button, and the download's paused. Now notice it says fail over here. It's actually still come into our finished section, and it's checking the success callback. So we don't want it to come into this finished section when it's paused, so we can just say and not paused. So let's try that again. We'll just clear out that download by clicking abort there, recompile, and that will clean it out. So start, pause, and now it doesn't give us any messages over here because it's not getting into this section. Now we haven't implemented resume yet, so again I'm just going to click over here to abort that download and click this bin icon to clear it out. Again, clicking compile would also clear it out. Okay, to resume our downloads, we're going to go into our resume downloads function. This function here, server.downloadFile, actually returns a value of type download. It actually returns a download object. So we can save this in a variable. So we'll make a little variable up here called download. And in our download function, we'll say download equals that. So download equals our download file call. So now we have a download object, and we can do things like call stop on it and check its status. So now that we've got our download in an object, we can actually resume it. So that's in here. See resume there. So what we want to do when we resume is the first thing is we set pause to false. And then we say download.resume. And that will resume the download. So I'll hit compile, we'll hit start, our download's going, I'll hit pause, download's paused, and now I'll hit resume, download starts again. Now it's also possible with this method, the way we're doing pausing here is we're pausing and then we're waiting for the callback to actually do the pausing. And it's possible to actually just do the pausing in here as well. Just like that. In this case, that will work fine. In some other cases, it can. If you have a lot of downloads going at once, it might be a case that you hit pause over here, but that next download hasn't actually started, so it doesn't get paused. Which is why this way is safer, because it makes sure that the download started before it gets paused, and it just stops things hanging around. So I don't recommend doing it this way. With one file, it'll work, but with multiple files, you may hit issues. So that's just an explainer of why I've decided to go this way with it. So the next thing we need to do is abort our download. So we're going to have another function, abort downloads, and we'll set pause to false and abort equals true. And then we could do download.abort. And that will work. It will abort the download instantly. And I would probably leave that here in this case. But what we can also do, and what I would recommend you do if you've got a larger number of downloads, which is also why we're going to use this abort variable, is do the same thing we did for the pause button. So in here we'd have if abort this.abort. And then for the pause we'd have else pause this.stop. So now we can click compile again, delete that one that we've got hanging around there. So now I should be able to pause and abort the download. So we'll start the download. It's going along, I hit pause, it pauses, I hit abort, and it's aborted. And it says fail, which is fine because we aborted the download. So let's try that again. This time we won't pause it, we'll just go straight to abort. So start, it's downloading, hit abort, and the download's aborted. Now, it's often the case that when your user hits abort, you don't want it to just cancel, you want it to give them a prompt and say, "Are you sure you want to do this?" So let's just add that quickly. So in our abort downloads function, we can add a pop-up that says, "Are you sure you want to abort?" So we'll do that with engine.showYesNo window. We can give it a title, cancel download. We can give it some text. Are you sure you want to cancel the download? And then we give it a callback function. So this is going to be triggered when they press either yes or no. So function, and we get a value in here which we'll put in a response variable. We can call this variable anything we want. I'm just calling it response because it gets the user's response. And the response will be either true or false depending on if they pressed yes or no. So if the response is true, then we want to abort the download. And that's pretty much it. We don't want to abort the download otherwise, so that's good. Let me show you what happens here. So we hit compile. So now we'll hit start, and then we'll hit abort. And oh, it's just gone straight to the abort. I forgot because we've got this variable here setting to abort, which is actually triggering this here. So we need to just move this stuff into the response as well. So let's do that. Okay, so now all this stuff will only happen if they press yes. So I'll hit F5 again. So now we'll hit start and it's downloading. I'll hit abort and it says, "Are you sure you want to cancel?" But look down here, it's still doing the download. So while the user's thinking, it's still downloading. Okay, I'm going to cancel it. Let's see, it should cancel. There we go. So it cancelled. But you see, it's still going while the user's deciding whether or not to abort. So what we should do is when they first hit abort, we should pause the downloads. So when they hit abort, the first thing we're going to do in here is trigger our pause downloads function. And if they say yes to the "do you want to cancel," it's going to do what we have, it's going to cancel it. But if they don't, if they choose not to, we're going to resume our downloads. Okay, so let's try it again. So when I hit start, it's going to start the download. When I hit abort, it should pause the download and pop up a message. So the download is paused now. We've got our message. Now we can decide, do we want to cancel or not? And nothing's happening while we're deciding. So I decide I don't want to cancel, so it's going to resume the download. There we go. And then I go, actually, I do want to cancel it. Let's cancel it. And it's aborted. So hopefully this gives you something to get started with in implementing your own file downloader. As I say, I'll be doing another video where we'll do a slightly more complex example with multiple files, but this is the basics of it. So if you can get your head around this, you'll be fine with doing multiple files. There are edge cases and situations where it gets a bit more complicated, especially if you're pulling files, file URLs from a server and those URLs lead to downloads. That gets a bit tricky. As far as just doing a basic download is concerned, it doesn't really get much more complicated than this. I'll be posting this snippet up on Patreon for my higher tier supporters. Thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon, and it's nice to see the numbers growing on there, nice to see more people using HISE, and I'm really grateful for all of your feedback. If you've got any suggestions or comments, please leave them below the video on YouTube or Patreon. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.